the very idea of functional sovereignty is a kind of oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, right? Because
if the governance infrastructure is running on a mixture of peer-to-peer network, blockchain technology, it's extremely difficult for any single territorial sovereign to intervene, to modify it, to stop it.
Jeremy Walden once argued, he said, look, the point about proximity is that its twin is affinity, right? You know, where we find proximity, we find affinity. Where we find affinity, we find more proximity. You know, these two things go together.
To which extent do you believe that the creation of those functionally sovereign political entities that are the network nation can actually coexist peacefully? So today we're tackling one of the most challenging concepts in the context of political theory, which is the question of sovereignty. And what we want to ask is whether it is perhaps time today to rethink what it means in a networked age. Because traditional sovereignty has always been regarded as all or nothing. Either a state has it or it doesn't have it. And in order to have it, the state needs to control a territory, makes law, and enforce them with coercive force. But then what happens when communities exercise some degree of self-governance without controlling land? And can sovereignty be unbundled, where different entities are governing different functions, even within the same space or the same territory? So, for instance, your identity or credentials can be governed by one entity, and then your currency system by another, and perhaps your welfare and your education yet by another entity. And each of those entities, they have relative autonomy over this particular domain. This is what we call functional sovereignty, which is the capacity to organize and govern specific functions like identity, finance, or dispute resolution, you name it, with a certain degree of operational autonomy without needing to ask permission to any higher authority. And so to discuss these questions, we're joined today by two scholars who have been thinking and rethinking sovereignty from complementary angles. So Morshed Mannan is a researcher at the European University Institute, and his work is exploring how cooperatives and common-based organizations achieve new forms of self-governance outside of traditional state structure. And Morshed has been examining in particular how community can claim functional autonomy through legal and organizational design. And then Neil Walker is a theorist of sovereignty and constitutionalism, and he's also the author of the book Sovereignty in Transition. And his work interrogates how sovereignty is being transformed, potentially fragmented, and redistributed in an interconnected world. And of course, what it means for political authority and legitimacy. And so together, we will explore functional sovereignty as a concept and how it can be leveraged by network nations in order to achieve self-governance. And what does it mean, in fact, for those communities to govern themselves without any exclusive claim over a particular territorial domain? Thank you both for coming to this episode. So what we want to discuss today is the question of functional sovereignty. And basically, this starts from these basic premises that traditionally, when we think about sovereignty, we're thinking about this kind of like all or nothing situation, whether there is a sovereign or there is not a sovereign. Because when we're thinking in like the more like nation state framework, then we have like exclusive sovereignty over a particular territory. And then we have the government, the state, which is responsible for exercising this sovereignty. And so what we want to discuss is when we're shifting away from the nation-state framework and moving into the network nation framework, then what does it mean when we are talking about sovereignty in a space which is not associated with a particular territorial geographical boundaries? And so essentially the whole framework around the concept of functional sovereignty is how and whether we can unbundle sovereignty into different sticks, where we have different entities that are governing different functions, even though these might be overlapping on the same territorial boundaries. And so essentially, the main premise is that the network nation conceptual framework is grounded upon is that we want to provide sovereignty to those emergent network communities, but this is a sovereignty that is not territorial but functional. And so we want to also discuss like how we can actually achieve functional sovereignty, what are the implications of functional sovereignty, and also the question of legitimacy and accountability in a context of functional sovereignty. Then what are the new premises and what are the new safety valve in order to ensure legitimacy? For the people, of course, that are not so acquainted with the concept of functional sovereignty, the way in which we're using it is really like this the capacity to organize and somehow like govern or self-govern specific functions. So it's not about like absolute and exclusive sovereignty, but it's about, for instance, a community having its own identity system or a community running its own financial institutions or like dealing with like dispute resolution in a self-sovereign manner, which does not rely on the traditional systems and institutions that are provided by existing nation states. In a way, therefore, that has both the self-governing aspect, but also the protection against interference, meaning that these self-governance functions are done in a way that it's difficult for an external party to influence or impinge or even stop the functioning of those operations. So this is kind of like the general gist where we're starting from. And then what we want to discuss with both of you is basically digging into a few of those questions. The first one is basically unbundling. So what does it mean when we are unbundling sovereignty, when we are separating some of the functions that usually are aggregated within one single entity, which is the state, which is, for instance, responsible for providing the security and the safety of the citizen, providing an identity system, providing a legal and normative system, social welfare, and so forth. And what happens when we're actually breaking this apart and some of those functions are managed by one entity and other functions are managed by another entity? And so the question that I have to you is basically, first and foremost, like when we're talking about functional sovereignty, it seems something kind of novel or special. So what is it, if from like an historical perspective, from like a legal perspective, like what is it that makes this particular setting of territorial absolute sovereignty the dominant framework? And what are the examples that we have already in which we saw some degree of unbundling taking part?
I think obviously there's a deep historical framework, which makes the state so central. And of course, before, we moved from the kind of dynastic concept of the state, to the more abstract concept of the state. I mean, earlier forms of sovereignty and sovereignty in 14th century France is very, very much particularized on the individual ruler, whatever it might be. And gradually what happens in late medieval ages, early modern ages, is you move to what Quentin Skinner calls a double abstraction, the abstraction of rule, but also the abstraction of the people. You move towards a sense of the unity of the manifold. You keep the sense of the unity and the comprehensiveness, but it's now within raison d'etat, it's now within an abstract idea of what the powerful party would be. So unity has many, many iterations. It has iterations before the modern state. And then it has its more complex iterations in the context of the modern state. So I guess, that's sort of where we come from. But in terms of the interesting question you ask is, to what extent is that already being chipped away? Is it already being eroded, et cetera, et cetera? When I first started writing about sovereignty in a more conventional legal context 20, 25 years ago, I actually talked about the idea in the context of the European Union of, I think I used the phrase autonomy without exclusivity, which translates into what you're talking about, because you had the autonomous sense of self-sovereignty, to use one of the terms that you talk about, without it being exclusive, without it being comprehensive. So you already had that sense of a kind of, parceling out, disaggregating, maybe even siloing of legal and political authority. Now, interestingly, at that point, the great thrust in thinking beyond unitary sovereignty was either in terms of globalization, transnationalism, so that the challenge was, how do we incorporate the fact that so much legal and political authority has escaped the state, and we find it at the regional level of the EU, or we find it at the global level, wherever. At the same time as this other older criticism of sovereignty, where if you take one of the meanings of sovereignty, Stephen Krasner had 4 or 5 different meanings, and one was a purely empirical thing. It was about power rather than authority. And then you could always say, well, sovereignty in terms of, if you start talking about military power and economic power, it's not necessarily about the state anyway. But even if you think of it in terms of legal authority, frameworks like the European Union and various others already were asking in their own way, the same question as you were asking. Interestingly, though, they were not necessarily deterritorializing sovereignty. They were basically pitching one kind of territorial extent against another. If I can mention one other, almost like a counter trend, one of the debates that I've been very involved in recent years is with a lot of environmental scholars who almost criticize sovereignty from the other direction, right? Whereas one of your points is digitalization and infrastructure replaces physical space. There's another view for someone like Daniel Matthews in his book on Earthbound saying, no, the problem is that territory is not material enough. We need to replace territory with terrain, right? And terrain then brings in the material world, and it brings in animals, it brings in nature, it brings in the natural world, etc., etc. So sovereignty's myopia there isn't that it doesn't take in the non-material, it's that it doesn't take in some aspects of the material at the same time. So I think that's interesting that two of the most fundamental contemporary critiques of the old version of sovereignty kind of come from opposite directions. One from a dematerial direction, and the one from a greater materialization direction. So I'll just put that out there just as a kind of point of departure, and maybe something that we can take up. I've got various responses to these, but let's see how the conversation flows.
Yeah, I think it will be useful to get some examples of both from the history and the present. What are examples of things that we might want to qualify as functional sovereign?
In that sense, the European Union saw itself as a functional sovereign in terms of creating a free trade area. So it was a limited form of economic sovereignty, right? And then, of course, within that, you then get various other ideas which developed. So when the European Central Bank and the euro as a currency came out, people started talking about monetary sovereignty. So there was that further kind of siloization of the. To use the EU example is quite interesting, because I think one of the best insights into the legal and political history of the European Union is to say that whereas the state, embraced its sovereignty from the top down, it made a claim to, a level down, it made a claim to the absolute sovereignty and the comprehensiveness of it. Then it gradually filled in the spaces. The EU did it the other way around. It started with narrow economic sovereignty, began to develop a degree of social sovereignty, a degree of security sovereignty, etc., etc. So it was more a kind of bottom-up reaggregation of some of the functions that you associate with sovereignty, as opposed to start with the whole and then fill it in, which was a kind of traditional way of thinking about it. For a long, long time, the European Union, sovereignty was a swear word. It would use terms like primacy or or authority or supremacy even, but actually avoided the sovereignty word because it realized that that was something which was symbolically so closely associated with the state,
Mhm.
and I think that's still the case. I mean, one of the things I see in your own work is I know you have good theoretical reasons for avoiding the concept of digital sovereignty. But even if you didn't, you'd probably have practical reasons because digital sovereignty is a kind of it's kind of provocation, isn't it? It's once you start using the terminology like that, it feels as if it's a competing claim rather than a complementary claim or whatever it might be. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in on this point to see if I could add a few sort of reflections looking beyond examples of monetary sovereignty or even the type of federalism that we've been talking about so far. And if we look at, and this is partly based on what I know about network nations already, if we look at the history of ideas like guild socialism, that going back over a century now, we realize that there have long been attempts at trying to understand political orders in which, for example, workers' associations can be organized at the base level by, let's say, according to sector, according to industry. They can be democratically run and then have a tiered structure where at the top you have something like a national guild congress that this is seen as complementary to to national parliament. These sorts of ideas have, been around for a while that explicitly use the language of both sovereignty, but also the idea that there can be sovereignty claims about different functions in an economy or in a society. So if in this example, it would be about having functional sovereignty over the domain of work. And one of the interesting reasons why this topic of GDH Cole's guild socialism is coming back into the sort of forefront now is because of the fact that a lot of his ideas were animated by this fear that machines are going to dominate workers, and we need industrial democracy at a larger scale to be able to deal with the domination of workers by machines. And so here, the fact that there was already an idea of how you would create a parallel structure that can go beyond just the workplace into the political domain, have its own sort of ways of dealing with legitimacy based on certain democratic practices and checks and balances, is, I think, an important historical lesson. I want to then, sort of bring into the conversation the fact that aside from the European Union, and not very far away either, you've had experiments at what you could describe as decentralized constitutionalism. And so, in various constitutions of the erstwhile Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, you have, this idea of not just decentralizing power from the federal structure to republics and autonomous provinces and so on, but also to local assemblies of people's assemblies, people's and structures that are like this, because of the fact that you are able to imagine that sovereignty not only rests with peoples and communities, but that they shouldn't just be attached to particular territories. And what's, I think, interesting, again, from looking at what you could say, an idea that has an imprint of this decentralized socialist structure that I mentioned, is that you have both the language of constitutionalism there, but also this idea that um, sovereignty doesn't only reside in territorial units, but in people, in nations. And again, a lot of these concepts that we're talking about today and is in the network nations piece. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, and I want to bring like the way in which Frank Pasquale has actually been referring to the concept of functional sovereignty, where he basically identify ways in which existing large multinational corporations are somehow acting as effective functional sovereign, with example, for instance, of Amazon, which somehow starts dictating the rules of international trade. Facebook, which all of a sudden provides like identification system to log in into many other, like almost a passport system. So to which extent do you actually agree that is this a form of functional sovereignty, and what are the implications in terms of law to this type of functional sovereignty?
I think there are two comebacks on that, right? And one is the crude one, but the one which we still have to pay attention to, which says that the very idea of functional sovereignty is a kind of oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, right? Because the whole idea of sovereignty is comprehensive. It covers everything, etc., etc. So the point of that would either be there's a kind of loaded version of that, which is a statist version, which says, look, whatever you're doing, you're just playing around at the margins. It's still a state-centered world. There's a non-loaded version of it, which is more intellectually respectable, which says, look, the deep code of legality was always based upon, the fact that in the final analysis, it was a single source of authority. So if we're moving beyond that, then maybe we should move beyond the language of sovereignty, in order to capture whatever it is that we're moving beyond. So, that would be one kind of criticism, or one kind of challenge. I think another type of challenge is to say that, and here I think, also drawing on some of Morchett's earlier examples, that, and also my example of the European Union, which is to say that there's a difference between forms of decentralization of authority, which are still to some extent territorially coded, and those which are not. If you have the notion of territory, and then you say within the territory there are localities, or beyond the territory there's a supranational space, then it begins to sound, at one level it might be about functional specificity, but it also begins to sound like something which is to some extent still coded in terms of territory, right? And that raises particular sorts of issues about finality of jurisdiction, etc. I think when you move towards either economic power, or digital power, let's treat these as slightly different things, then whatever they are not territorially coded in the same sort of way, and the kind of challenge that they, exert against territorially coded power is probably different in kind. I'm not making a normative point here, just a conceptual point. It's different in kind than the ones which are about, the decentralization, the radical decentralization of authority, still within a form of a territorial coding. And one point here I'd like to make, because I think it's an important one, and it's something that I was thinking of when I read your paper on the network nation, and when you were talking about proximity as proximity within a territorial space as being a key thing, and I'm reminded of something that Jeremy Waldron once argued. He said, look, the point about proximity is that its twin is affinity, right? Where we find proximity, we find affinity. Where we find affinity, we find more proximity. These two things go together. The Kantian phrase, we're unavoidably side by side. But once you're unavoidably side by side, you develop affinities, you develop greater proximities, etc. And I think the interesting question is, to what extent that kind of dynamic, one of the interesting things I think about Network Nation is the way in which that dynamic develops in digital space, or in digital non-space, as opposed to in other places, So, these sorts of, I think that's an important. So we'll have to look at all the. I think it's, in other words, what I'm saying is, I think it's important to differentiate between different levels and different types of challenge, to the received concept of state sovereignty.
Right. I just want to distinguish though, because I think that you say this thing that I think is important, that it's almost an oxymoron to talk about functional sovereignty because sovereignty is absolute. But I think that's precisely the conversation that we want to have, is like, is this vision of sovereignty as something that needs to be absolute? Is it still realistic? Is it still the case practically? Can we, and when we look especially to those corporations which are effectively achieving some degree of sovereignty despite the fact that the absolute territorial sovereign is the state, then what are we talking about? Are we talking about something else than sovereignty, because sovereignty needs to be this territorial and exclusive thing? Or does it make sense to somehow qualify sovereignty in this functional manner in order to therefore accommodate the possibility of there being multiple layers of sovereignty? And I will say that the concept of overlapping sovereignties is not novel. There has always been some sovereign, like the European Union being an example, right? So sovereignty is never actually absolute. It's always some kind of like negotiated agreement. And then sometimes we have those emergent power or influence that might not have been like officially declared, but somehow have constituted themselves in a manner that actually could take its own degree of sovereignty. And so I think there is this interesting distinction, I would say, in which, like, when we think of traditional sovereignty, this is always something that has been declared either by a particular treaty, by a constitution, or by mutual recognition. But then functional sovereignty is not is hardly ever declared. It's constituted because it's actually earned, it's emerged because of practice. But there is a point in which, looking at who actually has power and who has the power of intervention, we might actually notice that there is overlapping sovereignty, and there are those new emergent entities that actually have managed to achieve constitutively some degree of sovereignty, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I will just jump in on this particular point because I think it relates back to Pasquale's chapter or his earlier blog on this as well. Because when I read that particular text, what comes to mind is the use of the term functional sovereignty as a critique, in a certain critical sense, where it's describing a phenomenon, the Amazon example you mentioned, Facebook, etc. These types of examples as something more than privatization. So, you mentioned how there's, perhaps other ideas that become relevant. So you have, this wider discussion, especially in the type of law and political economy space in which, Pasquale is situating himself, this discussion about the, privatization, the greater control that private actors have in our lives, being extended to, for example, military domains, being extended to other aspects that we usually associate with the state. Earlier in our conversation, we were talking about currency and money. That becomes another, really relevant discussion as well once you start thinking about platforms trying to, create digital assets, even some of them having pretensions of potentially creating their own currencies as well. And so essentially going into these types of sectors and activities which we usually associate with the state. And so this type of intuition says that, something more is happening than just the older privatization type of discussion. And that's where something like functional sovereignty and the term sovereignty becomes more important as something we are taking from what is usually state sovereignty. And what I would like to add is that maybe in the network nations discussion, because I know that the contrast with network states and these other sorts of movements that are happening is the fact that there's a claim towards statehood. Here we can look at other sort of positive examples in which there have been bottom-up ways of trying to assert what we're discussing as a more positive conception of functional sovereignty without having to try to, exit from state structures or without having to, demand a privatization of a lot of state functions. But I will reserve those examples for a bit later, and if Neil wants to jump in.
Just a couple of things. I mean, just maybe going back just one step. I think earlier I mentioned Stephen Krasner's work, where he said there are 4 different forms of sovereignty, and only 3 of them have a legal register. You have international legal sovereignty, which is like external sovereignty. You have domestic sovereignty, which is internal. You have what he calls Westphalian sovereignty, which is one aspect of external sovereignty, about non-interference. And then you have what he calls interdependent sovereignty. And when I first wrote about this 21 years ago, I said, look, there's a real descriptive fallacy there where what he's talking about is, to use a potentia around potestas, he's talking about power rather than authority, right? And of course, if you start talking about power, then we're in a different ballgame, right? We might conclude that, the world is run by 10 corporations, if that's what we're saying. I'm not saying that, but, if it's just about power. So there has to be about, at some level, this has to be about the way in which, the legal and political come together in a certain type of authority. And my sense there would be that the way that we frame the question, we probably have to be quite careful, because if I went back to say, take a really famous legal figure like Hans Kelsen, right? Hans Kelsen, writing a century ago, if you asked him about sovereignty, he said, look, I can either think of the sovereign at the global level and that everything else is just a derivation from that, or I can turn the world upside down and I can treat it at the state level and everything is a derivation from the state upwards. In other words, what he was saying is that the legal and juridical gymnastics by which we talk about the division of authority are themselves quite flexible, right? And they always have been. And it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop us finding a way of accommodating the differences and the overlaps between different types of authority in ways that work. In other words, just because we don't know who the ultimate sovereign is in our circumstances doesn't make the legal world fall apart. It might mean there's some very, very few hard cases, but down in the ditches, for the most part, things won't change because it won't necessarily depend upon that. So I guess my point is that to some extent, we have to think about, I've tried to do this in my own work, we have to think about sovereignty as it's a discursive category, it's a claim which is being made, right? And certainly we can map it in terms of both the volume with which that claim is made, the assurance with which it's made, and to some extent the effectiveness with which it's made. But there's never been final answers to that question. There's never been, it's always been, there's always been contentions. If we think about it in terms of decolonization in the imperial world, sovereignty is not, if you go to Canada and deal with First Nations, they don't accept sovereignty as a concept. But they still find a way of getting along in terms of finding a legal order, which is not necessarily inconsistent with the legal order of the colonial power or whatever. So it's not that I don't think sovereignty matters, but I think there's probably, if we treat it in the phenomenal world as a claim which is being made, then it takes on a somewhat different significance, and and the counterclaims which are being made to that, they're all matters of degree. We just have to watch out that we don't fall into the trap of thinking there was a world, this world where these things were somehow fully achieved, and now we've moved away from that. We're always moving away from it in interesting ways, but equally interesting is the way in which the language of sovereignty it's like a boomerang, it keeps coming back. It keeps coming back at the same.
I hear what you're saying, but I think I just want to like double click on this distinction between declarative and constitutive.
Yeah,
Mostly because I think it's relevant for the network nation work, in the sense that where the network nation distinguishes itself from the network state is that it has an aspiration of functional sovereignty,
yeah,
but it doesn't have an aspiration of declarative sovereignty. It doesn't expect to play the usual game of like the Westphalian system of sovereignty, but it's rather technically and functionally aspiring to achieve this type of sovereignty. And the reason I think the distinction between declarative and constitutive is interesting is with regard to legitimacy, because when something has been declared, then there are specific frameworks and rules by which we can assess whether it's legitimate or not, whether it's actually following up to what it has been declared. Whereas when we have a particular type of sovereignty, which is constitutive, which has just come into being, then it's harder to assess the legitimacy. And arguably, we can say that this functional sovereignty described by Frank Pasquale about Amazon might not be regarded as legitimate because you have one corporation deciding the rules of international trade, whereas we would hope that the functional sovereignty that is constitutive of the network nation will be regarded both internally by the community but also exogenously by other actors as a legitimate
Sure.
form of sovereignty. And so how do we actually play around the question of legitimacy in the context of a constitutive type of sovereignty?
Can I just say one thing that I would feel, in some ways, I'm not trying to be contrarian here, but in some ways I would prefer if we, every time you said sovereignty, you said self-determination, you know, because basically that's what you're talking about. You're talking about a form of.
Can you actually just for the sake of everyone in the audience, how do you distinguish self-determination from sovereignty?
Well, self-determination, I think, would be self-determination makes no claim about the breadth of the competence within which the self-determination takes place, right? You know, it would be, you know, so the self decides what is determining, you know, the collective self, whereas I think sovereignty always assumes exclusivity, comprehensiveness, fullness, etc. You know, in
But
other
that's why
words,
we're qualifying it with functional,
yeah,
because we
sure,
want to
okay,
move
fine.
away
So,
from this.
so that's another way of dealing with it. Yeah, I get it. I
Mm.
understand that. You know, when I look at the network nation stuff and the you know, at the end of the day, you know, there are two massive sets of challenges, you know, which may or may not be met. You know, one is clearly, you know, what it means internally, because, you know, that sense of, you know, I mean, I think it's a good way to talk about it in terms of the constitutive dimension of it, not just because it tells us that there is no set of rules which already applies, etc., etc., and we can see whether it conforms to it, but because there is always something paradoxical about self-constitution. You know, there's always something there that, you know, so who decided where we started, you know, and, you know, when you think about, you know, how you move from non-open source to open source, and how, you know, how basically, how often things, you know, there's an original sin in how things start often, you know, and how you move from the original sin to a legitimate form of self-constitution and self-development, etc., is clearly a massive question, you know, and I think it's a massive question in the digital world as well. I think the second massive question, though, is the external question, because again, I mean, I like the notion of network nation more than, you know, network state. I agree with you. I mean, I think but one of the things it does is that it makes it clear that you're dealing with something functionally specific, right? You know, I'd probably have to get more used to the notion of a nation as something which is functionally specific, because it's, you know, again, we're doing interesting, you know, ambitious things with language there, you know, and that's fine. We can do that. But I think certainly within the legal world, the world of people who are interested in these questions in terms of transnational law, the question always comes back there is that, you know, as you purify the internal, right, which might be extremely difficult anyway, you then you export so many of the problems to the relationship between different silos, the relationship between different nations. You know, the more nations you have, you know, the question of the relationship between nations, it stops being a marginal question. It becomes a very, very central question, you know, and that is an issue. You know, I think some of the people I know, some of the best people working in this field, like Piers and Banson, Nico Krish, etc., these are the questions they're asking. We think, yeah, we get it, you know, and some of the examples they use are digital examples. And it's almost like the bigger challenge is ensuring not just the intelligent and legitimate closure of the system, but also the intelligent and legitimate ways in which it remains adequately open to other systems. You know, and that I think is, you know, I don't see so much about that in your network nation paper. I mean, it
Yeah,
can't
I mean,
cover everything.
actually,
Yeah.
I think this is like you're making a point that is an important point because it's actually a point that we make
Yeah.
when we are arguing of why we think that network nation is a better approach than network state, because the network state is actually the concept of creating a new state which requires exiting from a previous state, which means that it leads to fragmentation of jurisdictions. And of course, while everyone is very aligned internally to one single network state, you're creating conflict
Sure.
between different network state and states. So the fragmentation is actually a fragmentation that could generate conflict, even though internally it's trying to be as cohesive as possible. So we don't have this problem. We have another problem, which is the problem of polycentricity, because instead of fragmenting jurisdictions and
Yeah.
therefore creating like horizontal fragmentation, we're creating vertical fragmentation,
Sure.
which is nothing is better or worse. It's just a different challenge to tackle. But all of Sweden, we now have multiple entities that are self-determining or are exercising a degree of functional sovereignty over different domains, which those domains are nonetheless overlapping in the territory and in the people, in the population that are subject to those different sovereign. And so, of course, this is the usual polycentricity problem, but like once we get not a fragmentation of jurisdiction horizontally, but once we get overlapping jurisdiction on a vertical layer, then new possible conflict also emerge on this vertical manner. And so then this is a question to both of you. It's like from like a polycentricity theory, from like a legal theory, etc. It's like, how do we manage conflict when the conflict are on the vertical line, when we actually have multiple sovereign overlapping because of either territory or membership? And then what is the way in which this type of conflict can be addressed?
You want to go first, Morshed, while I think about it?
Yes, of course. So, I mean, and we've talked a bit about this before in other contexts, Primavera, but I just wanted to, before getting into that, to say that I really, resonate with Neil's point because about self-determination being a very relevant concept here, even if maybe for various reasons that isn't used in the same way in the network nation context. I think it's very important primarily because we have this idea that the right of self-determination includes the right to have social, cultural, and economic development in a broader sense than just a narrow set of functions, which might be something that network nations strategically want. And relatedly, there's the possibility you don't have to claim a political entity like a state to be able to achieve self-determination in some way. That's just one particular type of goal. It doesn't have to be the only end goal. So I think in that sense, looking at this sort of international theory, legal law and theory on self-determination is useful. Coming to this particular point about polycentricity, I think if we go back to, some of the classic work that's at the intersection of polycentricity and the law, you end up coming to a lot of the discussion about, well, you need something that's like the U.S. Constitution, essentially, right? So there was this whole discussion several decades ago about the U.S. Constitution constituting a polycentric republic. And so you end up having here, depending on how you define it, you would then have to think of, well, you can create this as a type of not technological governance infrastructure, but still, something that I guess foreseeably now could be something that integrates technology, but like a governance infrastructure in the form of a constitution that does, has these checks and balances, has these roles articulated, that has an explicit identification of where these overlaps are emerging and how you would deal with them. We've talked about this before in other contexts, but we know that there's also this need to be able to preemptively deal with possible disputes, to deal with amendments. How would different overlapping structures within a polycentric system deal with particular crises that emerge that aren't foreseeable at the time of, for example, setting up this governance structure? I feel that looking at a lot of these historical examples, even beyond the US, at trying to create basically polycentric legal orders where you have these overlapping centers of authority, at some stage, a type of constitution was ultimately needed. And of course, we can think of non-state examples of this as well, but I think for now, I'll leave it at that and let Neil jump in.
I think, yeah, I mean, look, that I get where you're coming from, and I get why you're coming from there. But I mean, there's a kind of obvious objection to that, which is, so it sounds like a very unitary solution to a polycentric problem. You know, that finally you go back to the Constitution or something like the Constitution, and uh, that's not just a clever point. I think there's a genuine issue there about who decides. You know, and and the kind of infinite regress problem there. So, for example, I mean, a lot of my work in recent years has been, how the hell do we make the European Union with all of its many areas of functional sovereignty, if you want to use these terms, how do we make that legitimate? And of course, the question then is, so some people will say, well, you can't. It just has to be an aggregation of the national constitutions. Other people say, no, there has to be a European constitution for the European people. Other people say, no, there has to be a pouvoir constituant mixed, where you have the European people and the national peoples together. So the point being that people can't even decide on who decides, right? That's one of the issues with that kind of question. It doesn't mean that what you're saying isn't the right answer, but maybe there are other ways of thinking about this. So, for example, if you work in the area of the conflict of laws, so Primavera, I don't know if this is a more technical thing, where it's not public international law, it's not big treaties. It's saying where national legal systems, have different rules on, say, family or tort or economic law, whatever it might be, that often the question is, when you have a clash of jurisdictions, is actually which law should prevail, which of these laws should prevail.
Mhm.
It's a choice of law question, right? Now, you can actually imagine having a whole bunch of choice of law questions resolved in that sort of way without having to call the thing at the center of that constitution, right? What it is actually is something it's doing a different kind of uh, uh, work, which has something to do with mutual recognition. It's what my underlying my international law colleague calls a kind of architecture of credibilization, right? And that doesn't necessarily have to take the form of a constitution at the center. So I think we should be aware of that. I think we should also be aware, however, that there is a kind of there's a there's another sort of old-fashioned response to this, which says that the reason why we have, supranational authority and international authority is that precisely in order to deal with these sorts of questions, including digital nation questions, what we have is just, a bunch of different authorities at different levels, but in a kind of old-fashioned way. They're still sort of territorial authorities, and they have to work out the relationship between them. But, of course, we need local data protection laws, but we also need a law of privacy, which is at an international level. We need a law of freedom of expression, which is at the international level, et cetera, et cetera. And so maybe the architecture or the scaffolding, as you call it, maybe a lot of that scaffolding is still actually, in the final analysis, made up of legal norms which actually come from old-fashioned editorial sources, but in a different combination than they once did. And I noticed, for example, in the paper, and I'm not trying to pick apart the paper, I thought it was a really interesting, good paper, but you talk about the general data protection legislation at the EU level, in the same breath as you're talking about the state. And I'm thinking, but it's not a state. The whole point about having the general data protection legislation is this something which is an umbrella over the states, and which somehow, resolve some of the differences between the states. I guess what I'm saying is that if you go through the old-fashioned language of multi-level governance within a territorial idiom, you can still get quite a long way to finding these sorts of regulatory solutions to the problems of network nations.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, so we need to think about, can we just apply existing international framework, or do we need to somehow accommodate those new political entity with new international framework, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. One of the great thinkers here, I think, and I know Morshed also like his work is uh, good to Teubner, his ideas where when he talks about the regulation of different social spheres like art or science or whatever it is, and one of his insights, I think, is also really important to to the digital world, is that what is constitutive of these different domains is different, right? So it's usually a binary. What is constitutive of the domain of art is beauty versus something else. What is constitutive of the data of the sciences is based upon scientific rationality versus something else. And on the basis of that, law, the law that we understand has a more or less central place, within that kind of system. It's something to do with the logic of the system itself always has a place for law within it. But it's not always, the political state laws at the center. The digital nation, maybe not so much. You know, the world of scientific consensus, maybe even less so, etc., etc. And I think that's interesting. In other words, it's saying every system needs to use its own forms of normative closure, but we should not assume that the form that normative closure takes is necessarily a legal form, or one that law is necessarily central to.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting transition to our last section, which is actually like in practice, right? So we've been talking a lot about functional sovereignty in theory. In practice, as you seem to insinuate, Neil, there are different ways in which this functional sovereignty can be achieved. The most obvious one is obviously the legal means, but there are many other ways, and when we look at the modern type of functional sovereignty, at least in the language of Frank Pasquale, they are not relying on law in order to achieve functional sovereignty. They are relying on other things, which is basically commercial platforms, technology, and so forth. So one question for the last 10 minutes is like, in your view, like, what is the minimal viable things that needs to come into being in order for a particular entity to be able to claim functional sovereignty?
Okay.
Maybe I can do the same and jump in a bit for just a few brief remarks. So one thing, I'm not absolutely sure if Pasquale is saying that law doesn't have a role in even his sort of articulation of functional sovereignty. I think technology, all of these things are an important aspect of this. Their business model, how they operate in the economy, are all important. Their power. But I think law does have a role in terms of private ordering, in terms of the type of contracts they impose on consumers and users, in terms of how they even influence the making of law. So I think law does have an important as part of that story, and I think that's relevant for thinking about this practical question too, about how we constitute rather than just declare network nations. Because if we look at some of these, let's say, humbler ways in which groups of people, who are not even maybe a group that can be called a nation or anything of that sort, but have a strong affinity to it towards each other. That whether that's because of location, whether that's because of interest, how they get to be recognized by the state in a way that we've been talking about in terms of functional sovereignty. In some cases, and I think a really important observation from some of this early work on network nations, they've been able to do this by showing that they are able to be mutually responsible towards one another in dealing with um, disputes, in terms of ensuring that they are responsible for one another. What we've been talking about, I think, in some of this literature as interweaving, because if we look at these humbler examples that I'm thinking of, like cooperatives and in the cooperative movement, in some countries, they've been able to get, let's call it functional sovereignty, in terms of, you know, whether they're able to regulate their own formation, their own governance, monitoring themselves, auditing themselves, in this wide variety of functions in which they engage in, because of the fact that they've been able to show that they have this mutual responsibility to one another and are able to act in this responsible manner. And so in Portugal, for example, cooperatives are not regulated by a traditional public authority like a cooperative or a business registrar, but by a body called CASIS, which is itself a public interest cooperative comprising representation from both the public sector and the cooperative movement. And this unique body has a really important function in both registering cooperatives and ensuring that they act in conformity with the law, ensuring that they're audited properly, and so on. And so this only happened because there was this mutual responsibility within this third sector outside of the public and private sphere. So I think there are examples we can look at in how this constituting of this solidarity and mutual responsibility was able to achieve this. I want to end by a point that I think Neil was just saying about law versus the type of constitutional example I mentioned, which is that if I completely agree with looking at private international law, choice of law rules, and so on, but I think that there are situations in which the recognition of entities, especially across borders, across these different domains, necessitates thinking about something like treaty making or constitution making and so on, and has happened in the past too. We end up having private international law conventions like the Hague Convention on the Enforcement of Trusts, because trusts are not recognized in the same way across all common law and civil law jurisdictions, and there is a need then to start thinking about not just using court-based interpretations, but also looking at lawmaking or policymaking at a one level higher.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all of these things. Maybe just I could say a couple of things. I mean, I think what's fascinating about the digital world here is that you still need some of the things that law provides. Some of the other things you maybe don't need, and but also perhaps you need certain things that law doesn't necessarily provide in other contexts, but where in other contexts there's something else that takes the place of it. So that sounds a little bit like a riddle. So let me try to explain. So even I realize that I'm sitting in the presence of people who are experts in in thinking and talking about blockchain and things like that, which I'm not. But something that's always fascinated me is the way in which blockchain replaces the discipline of law in some situations. A decentralized digital ledger that records transactions in a secure, transparent, unchangeable way. Okay, so we don't need Fort Knox anymore. We don't need the central bank. We can have a digital currency. Where people's trust in and confidence in the system, and that if they comply with the system, other people will comply with self in a way which is self-reinforcing, is provided digitally and technologically. It doesn't have to be provided by law. And not only is that the case, but it's provided digitally and technologically in a way which, it could be at least through some kind of, open coding, so even at the origins of the system, it could be open. So there's both a sort of democratic impulse there, but there's also a disciplining impulse that provides its own discipline through technology. What it doesn't provide is either the cultural dimension of affinity, which we were talking about earlier, or necessarily the innovative, institutionally democratic means of bringing together people who are not physically co-present. And what I noticed actually in your paper is that there's a really strong emphasis on the fact that most of these connections will be corporeal as well as they're digital, right? They're not just going to be one or the other. And especially the decentralization dimension of it. I mean, some of them are particularly about, for example, when you talk about this is about keeping diaspora communities together, etc. It's precisely about resolving the problem of non-proximity. But even when it's not, what you seem to be saying is that there probably has to be a dimension of this that if it's all done in digital space, then it's not quite going to happen. And the way that you think about a network nation, an aspect of the model would always be a hybrid. I know that's an imperfect word for what we're talking about, but it would be something which would be about physical connection and digital connection at the same time. And I actually think that's really important. If you don't have that, then, that in other words, digitality can reproduce some of the goods and some of the bads of physical co-presence, but it can't reproduce them all. So in that sense, it replaces some of the functions of law, but what it doesn't replace are some of the aspects that law is usually complemented by in physical spaces.
Yeah, just to clarify, when we talk about technology in the context of network nation, uh, it's not really a matter of like replacing or creating alternative system to the law. It's more about it meant mainly two things. One is the network communication, which is in order for anything even slightly similar to a nation to emerge, you need a cultural alignment. You need like shared culture, shared systems, shared value systems. And this is something that network communication can help. And blockchain as such doesn't help at all with that. It's actually network communication in the more traditional sense. The other thing, which is actually specifically relevant to this discussion on functional sovereignty, it's actually decentralized infrastructure, blockchain, peer-to-peer network, and so forth. What they do is that they actually operate outside of any jurisdiction because they are distributed. They are a little
Sure.
bit everywhere, but therefore they're also nowhere. And this is relevant when we talk about constitutive functional sovereignty, because all of a sudden, if your governance infrastructure is running on a server located in a particular country, or at any point in time, the exclusive territorial sovereign of that country can come and shut down that server, you're shutting down the whole governance infrastructure. Whereas, if the governance infrastructure is running on a mixture of peer-to-peer network, blockchain technology, whatever, you name it, then it's extremely difficult for any single territorial sovereign to intervene, to modify it, to stop it. And that's where this degree of self-determination and functional sovereignty kicks in because of the distributed nature of the technology. And so when we're actually talking about the role of technology in a network nation, it's explicitly concerning one is the cultural building because of digital proximity, and the other one is creating sovereign infrastructure in order to then be able somehow to achieve a particular degree of functional sovereignty within the scope of what that infrastructure can govern. Okay, we're pretty much at time, but I want to ask the last question, which can be very short in the answer, but it's just like opinions. Because as we discuss sovereignty and functional sovereignty and overlapping layers of sovereignties, we kind of like we also need to think about what's the relationship, like as we advocate for network nation as a more friendly alternative to the network state when it comes to the relationship with the nation states. To which extent do you believe that the creation of those functionally sovereign political entities that are the network nation can actually coexist peacefully? Meaning, to which extent is the existing current absolute sovereign, that is the state, willing to accept the emergence of new functionally sovereign entity, which are not in direct conflict in the same way as the network state is in direct conflict with sovereignty of the state, but is nonetheless somehow stepping on its territory, stepping on its people, and so forth. And so, to which extent do you see this as a viable coexistence, or to which extent do you think that the nation state will kick back and actually try to fight against the emergence of those network nations because of the functional sovereign overlap that they have?
What's that thing when you get stone, scissors, and what's the third thing? I can't remember what it is, but the things that have a different relationship to each other. But the point here is there's three players in this game, yeah? There's the states, there's the platforms, and then there's the online communities and there's a democratic space that you're talking about. So I mean, it seems to me that the so my first point, my first reaction here is that, in many ways the enemy here is not the enemy, but the adversary is the commercial platforms. They're the ones that are and I guess that leads on to my second point, which is that uh, if states also are aware of this, then that might be one of the ways in which states are more open to the third element, i.e. the democratic communities online. If the alternative is the world is run by Elon Musk or is run by other people who are not Elon Musk. So I don't mean to be flippant here, but it does change the politics of it, and the states are always concerned with what they might see as fugitive power, power that they don't control. I guess the point is, what are the forms? I mean, states and sovereign states always have a tendency to over control, but what are the types of fugitive power that they're most scared of? I think it's the fugitive power of corporations rather than the fugitive power of democratic communities. Or at least that's the argument that has to be made.
Thank you. Morshed?
I mean, I just want to add a little bit to Neil's point, where I think we're starting to see states becoming a bit anxious about the power of digital communities just because of all of these youth revolutions that have been happening over the past year, aside from, the discussion that, Neil just pointed out
Yeah.
regarding corporations and fugitive power of corporations. So the use of digital platforms, both centralized and also peer-to-peer, to be able to foment social movements, which in a way is now an extension and even going beyond some of the patterns we saw in the previous decade with, starting with the Arab Spring and so on and so forth. And I think there we end up having this discussion where states might have a certain degree of anxiety of what this means for political stability, for people to mobilize very quickly online. Obviously, now being able to also raise capital, not just discuss, using these tools as well. So there is that part where there might be a bit of contention, of course, and concern. But I think another point that is relevant is about the particular type of claim that is actually made beyond, these sorts of social movements. I think some of these digital communities, as we know, as Neil was also mentioning, are physical communities which are interacting in different ways with states. And if we take the politics point on again, if they are within a territory which is having a rise of nativism, a rise of a sort of apathy towards minorities and so on, this idea that you might have digital nomads who are regularly entering into your territory might be seen, again, with a type of antipathy, which doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like the technology. So it's, almost like this dual phenomenon where a particular, right-wing leaning state or polity is very fond of a particular technology or set of technologies, but then they don't like the fact that this entails a particular physical community or set of communities also entering into their territory as well. And I see that as being an issue that's starting to emerge a little bit as well, where people like a lot of these advances with new technologies, but they don't necessarily like the people behind them. And I think that's a particular issue in which, when we start thinking of states as also collections of voters and so on, then that we might see a bit of pushback to.
Yeah, but I mean, also just very quickly, I mean, I was making that mistake as well. But states are not monoliths. There are different sorts of states. And there are different sorts of politics within states. And I look at people like, the new leader of the Green Party in UK, Zach Polanski, or the guy who's running for mayor in New York, and he's a very, very different sorts of people. And their sense. I mean, they're already, they already get it at some level. Yeah, they already understand that that political power is only one form of power. And it has to find its accommodation with these other forms of power. So some of this is done through old-fashioned politics. We can't just assume that old-fashioned politics will always, will always achieve the old-fashioned solutions, and because you need some help from old-fashioned politics for this to work.
Great. This means that we might need new political entity to change the solutions.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We're out of time, but super nice discussion. Thanks a lot for helping us dig into these complex questions of functional sovereignty.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot.
Thank you.